In the closing years of the 19th century, the Kingdom of Korea stands at the heart of great power rivalries. Both Japan and China view the Korean peninsula as vital to their own security and national prestige, and each interferes deeply in Korean politics. The competition between these powers only heightens regional tension. In 1885, Anglo-Russian rivalry in Central Asia, known as the Great Game, extends into East Asia when Britain briefly seizes a Korean port. Meanwhile, the Russian Empire begins constructing the Trans-Siberian Railway to connect with its Pacific naval base at Vladivostok, territory it had previously coerced China into surrendering. The convergence of Russian influence, Japanese expansionism, and traditional Chinese claims ignites a Korea-centered version of the Great Game in the 1890s, one that soon plunges the region into war. Inside Korea, political turmoil intensifies. Years of elite infighting foster bitter struggles within the Joseon dynasty between King Kojong, Queen Min, and the king's father, the Taiwan Gun. At the core of their disputes lies Korea's stance toward the outside world. Long nicknamed the Hermit Kingdom for its isolation, Korea remains a tributary of the Qing Empire. During the 1870s and 1880s, reformers advocate emulating Japan's rapid modernization, while conservative Confucians insist on preserving traditional ties with China. At the same time, numerous peasant uprisings challenge both corruption among royal officials and foreign interference. Both China and Japan fear that chaos in Korea might endanger their interests. China even tries to reassert control through what has been described as a modernized form of Qing imperialism in the 1880s, summed up by influential Viceroy Li Hongzhang. For China, Korea is a dependent of China. For all others, Korea is independent. Jaeger, 64. Despite their rivalry, both China and Japan suffer under unequal treaties with Western powers and have endured internal wars. China's humiliations at the hands of Britain and France drive its self-strengthening movement, while Japan's Meiji reforms pursue modernization at a feverish pace. Both nations modernize under immense strain. By 1894, continuous coups and rebellions leave King Kojong presiding over a fragile, corrupt administration. Meanwhile, a religious movement called the Tonghaks rises under Choejeou, blending Buddhist, Confucian, and Taoist ideas while condemning royal corruption and Western encroachment. In February, Tonghak followers revolt against abusive local officials in the south. The royal army proves too weak to suppress them, prompting the king to request Chinese assistance. Beijing dispatches a small expedition in June and, as per the 1885 accord, notifies Tokyo, but only after its ships have already departed for Asan. Japan deems this a violation and sends its own troops. Ironically, the rebellion collapses by June 11th. China's representative Yuan Shikai proposes mutual withdrawal, but Japanese Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi faces pressure from hawkish ministers and a fiery press. Eager to avoid appearing overly aggressive to Britain as Tokyo and London near the end of their unequal treaty, he insists Japanese forces will remain until Korea enacts reforms addressing the roots of unrest. Li Hongzhang seeks mediation through Britain and Russia, following the Qing strategy of using barbarians against barbarians, but both decline. He hopes to avoid war, doubting China's military strength, especially knowing that Dowager Empress Cixi has diverted naval funds to build a lavish palace for her birthday. Emperor Guangxu briefly considers war with Japan to assert independence from his aunt, but most of his ministers oppose the idea. Still, he sends reinforcements to Korea. In Tokyo, war now seems inevitable. On July 19th, Envoy Keisuke Otori demands that King Kojong expel the Chinese and implement reforms to assert independence. On July 23rd, Japanese troops force the king to accept his father's leadership. 2 days later, Japanese warships attack Chinese vessels at the Battle of Pengdo, sinking a cruiser and a troop ship carrying 1,000 men. Beijing declares war on August 1, 1894. The First Sino-Japanese War has begun. Many Japanese, including liberals, greet the conflict with zeal, portraying it as a struggle between a modernized nation and a decaying old order, or as Japan's duty to advance Asian civilization. Many in the West echo this view, shaped by anti-Chinese prejudice. Though China is far larger and wealthier, its military remains fragmented. Provincial governors command semi-independent armies that extort civilians and lack modern training. Li Hongjiang's reforms had created two relatively modern forces. The Beiyang Fleet, boasting two massive German-built battleships unmatched by Japan, and the Huai Army, modestly trained and equipped along Western lines. Japan's army and navy, however, are better disciplined, equipped, and organized, led by officers trained in Western doctrine. For years, Tokyo has diverted resources from the imperial court to strengthen its forces, and by June 1894, it has even broken Chinese diplomatic and military ciphers. Japan's strategy is to secure communications in Korea, dominate the Yellow Sea, drive Chinese forces out of the peninsula, and possibly invade Manchuria to topple the Qing. China's objective is to encircle Japanese units near Seoul to preserve influence, but Japan acts faster. Japanese troops advance on July 28th, before war is formally declared, defeating Chinese forces at Seonghwan that night. General Ye Jichao initially plans to hold Asan, but, learning that reinforcements were lost at sea and misjudging Japanese strength, retreats north. The Chinese abandon southern Korea and march 250 kilometers to Pyongyang, surviving off local resources. The city's defenses, rivers, hills, forts, and earthen walls are formidable. Japanese commander Yamagata Aritomo plans to storm it from 4 directions. Meanwhile, after a friendly fire mishap, Ye reduces patrols, leaving his army blind to the Japanese approach from inland. On September 14th, backed by 4 gunboats, the Japanese assault begins. The Chinese fail to exploit the moment as the Japanese cross the river, though they respond with fierce counterattacks and cavalry charges. The following day, Japanese reinforcements arrive in the northern hills and join the fight, executing the planned pincer and seizing the city's north gate. General Ye tells the Japanese he will surrender the next morning, yet secretly orders the garrison to slip away under cover of darkness, a withdrawal that collapses into chaos. Chinese officer Lu Shushan later describes the nightmarish panic. Those Chinese soldiers who were in the front were fired upon by the Japanese and started to retreat, but those in the back wanted to rush forward. It was so dark and crowded that one could not distinguish between enemies and friends, so all the Chinese took out their weapons and began fighting each other. Some even killed themselves out of sheer terror. Jaeger, 142, fragmented command. Among 4 generals, sabotages coherent action. Rumors spread that Manchu units fled first while some Muslim contingents fought on. In barely 2 days, the Japanese seize Pyongyang, capturing vast stocks of arms, supplies, and horses, while suffering only about 160 dead against roughly 2,000 Chinese killed and 700 captured, prisoners who, according to reports, receive relatively humane treatment. Even after the land defeats in Korea, China's Beiyang Fleet retains control of the Yellow Sea and the maritime approaches to Manchuria and Korea's west coast, yet its commanders do not aggressively engage the Japanese. On September 17th, Admiral Tsukayuki Ito's combined Japanese fleet unexpectedly sights the Chinese near Haiyang Island. Chinese Admiral Ding Ruchang struggles to form his line. When the Japanese close and shift from column to diagonal, Ding ought to respond. But his second-in-command, Commodore Liu, impulsively orders the flagship's main guns to open fire. The concussion from that salvo knocks Admiral Ding and his British advisor, Vice Admiral William Tyler, unconscious at a crucial moment. Tyler later admits he never learned why the Commodore acted as he did. With the admiral incapacitated, Japanese gunners concentrate on the weaker Chinese ships and set several aflame. They then batter the 2 Chinese battleships, severing communications aboard the Ding Yuan. Japanese shells slaughter so many sailors that the capital ships barely remain combat-worthy, though they do not sink. Admiral Ito ultimately breaks off the action after his own flagship is struck. In the aftermath, Chinese officers falsify reports, an established practice to avoid execution, and the Beiyang Fleet emerges crippled. 5 Chinese ships sunk against 3 Japanese damaged. The Japanese victories at Pyongyang and at sea opened the door for operations on Chinese soil. By late October, General Yamagata's First Army crosses the Yalu River and pushes toward the Manchu stronghold of Shenyang, while General Oyama lands 24,000 troops on the Liaodong Peninsula, aiming for China's key naval base at Port Arthur. Shenyang holds symbolic value for the Qing court, but Port Arthur is the real military prize, the only harbor where Chinese warships can be repaired. Although the approaches are guarded by modern fortifications, the Japanese quickly neutralize them. Land and sea forces encircle Port Arthur. Oyama summons General Wei Rucheng to surrender. Wei replies with a sortie, but the Japanese repulse it and seize the remaining inland forts within hours. Once more, Japanese superiority in firepower, discipline, mobility, and leadership decides the day, repeating the pattern seen at Pyongyang and in the Yellow Sea. A foreign observer later recalled the lopsidedness of the fighting. At the ramparts, not a Chinaman remained. They fled from fort to fort along the high wall, firing as they went, and making a stand at every point till too close for rifles. All over the hills they were chased, and for many miles around hardly 100 yards could be passed without sight of a Chinese corpse. Jaeger 151. Chinese commanders abandon their ranks in disguises and flee. Japanese units occupy the city on November 21st. Up to this point, the Japanese have generally behaved with restraint toward defeated foes, but now rumors inflame the troops. Stories that Chinese soldiers were dressing as civilians or that civilians fired on Japanese units circulate, and reports claim Chinese forces had displayed the heads of slain Japanese soldiers before the city fell. Enraged, some Japanese units respond with brutal retribution. Over the next 3 days, Port Arthur becomes the scene of a massacre both inside and outside the town. Soldier Okabe Makio of the 1st Division records the fury in his diary. As we entered the town of Port Arthur, we saw the head of a Japanese soldier displayed on a wooden stake. This filled us with rage and a desire to crush any Chinese soldier. Anyone we saw in the town, we killed. The streets were filled with corpses, so many they blocked our way. We killed people in their homes. By and large, there wasn't a single house without from 3 to 6 dead. Blood was flowing and the smell was awful. We sent out search parties. We shot some, hacked at others. The description captures how discipline frayed and violence spiraled, as fear, rage, and rumors combined to produce horrific reprisals against soldiers and civilians alike. They just threw down their arms and ran. Slashing and firing, it was wild exhilaration. Behind us, the artillery gave 3 cheers, Banzai, for the Emperor. Lone 155. Foreign correspondents, such as Canadian James Creelman of the New York World, also witnessed Japanese troops killing women and children. Estimates of the massacre's toll differ widely. Some place it between 2,000 and 3,000, while sensational American newspapers of the time claimed as many as 60,000. Reports of the slaughter threaten Tokyo's diplomatic ambitions as the U.S. Congress prepares to debate a fairer commercial treaty with Japan. Foreign Minister Mutsu Munemitsu fears that if Japan is portrayed as barbaric, the treaty will collapse. In response, Tokyo launches a coordinated disinformation campaign in American and British papers to discredit the allegations. The effort succeeds. Many American lawmakers dismiss the reports as exaggerated. Some eyewitnesses soften their stories, and in February 1895, Congress ratifies the treaty. While Japan manages the fallout abroad, its position inside Korea becomes more tangled. The kingdom is said to have 2 kings. Japan's proclaimed purpose was to guarantee Korean independence from China, yet its real intent is dominance. Tokyo restored the king's father, the Taiwangun, to power in July, but he and his conservative allies resist Japan's reform agenda. By August, the Taiwangun secretly appeals to China for aid. Chinese troops in Korea will provide an occasion for our deliverance. I hope the Celestial Empire will extend protection to our dynasty and court by sweeping away the traitors in the current regime who are selling the country to the Japanese. Jaeger 169. He later turns to the Russian legation and even plots to assassinate pro-Japanese Koreans. Once the conspiracy is uncovered, the Japanese swiftly depose him. The Taewon-gun then calls upon the Tonghak rebels to rise once more. Though divided between radicals and moderates, the Tonghaks, angered by Japanese requisitions and abuses from Korean officials, join forces with aggrieved peasants to rebel again. On October 12th, they launch a full-scale uprising that descends into a savage civil war involving the Tonghaks, Japanese troops, royal forces, and local militias known as Minpos. The conflict is brutal, marked by mutilations, decapitations, and scorched earth tactics. Chronicler Huang Hian recounts one clash. The Minpos were excellent marksmen. The bullets came raining down upon the bandits, Tonghaks, and the entire valley was quickly filled with corpses. The next day, however, the bandits mustered their men and entered Hadong, burned 10 civilian homes, and declared they would kill all hiding Minpo. They then pillaged nearby villages. Jaeger 178-179. Tokyo dispatches reinforcements. A 3,000-strong Japanese-Korean government force marches south, smaller in number but far better armed than the 10,000 Tonghaks, who wield mostly matchlocks and bamboo spears. During November and December, Japanese-led forces win a string of victories. Another column advancing from Pusan traps the rebels between them. Few are spared. Today we caught 7 Tonghak peasants who were left in the village, lined them up in the fields outside the castle, attached bayonets, and on Lieutenant Morita's order stabbed the victims simultaneously. The Korean soldiers watching were stunned. Jaeger 184. The final Tonghaks, including leader Jeonbong-jun, surrender in January 1895, yet Korea remains fractured and seething. As Japan crushes the rebellion, the Qing Empire begins seeking peace. Political upheaval grips Beijing. Rivals move against Li Hongzhang. Several generals are executed, and blame spreads across the court. In November 1894 and again in January 1895, Li requests negotiations, but Tokyo suspects China only wants to buy time, hoping Western powers will intervene. The Japanese therefore press the offensive. General Yamagata's First Army advances toward Shenyang and captures Haicheng on December 13th. In bitter winter fighting, Chinese counterattacks fail to retake the city but inflict severe losses, halting Yamagata's push. Japan now turns its sights to China's last major naval base, Weihaiwei. The Chinese cannot contest Japan at sea, though the remnants of the Beiyang fleet, 4 serviceable warships, still pose a threat to any invasion near Beijing. Japanese troops land in January, swiftly seize the coastal forts, their artillery, and the walled town of Weihaiwei. Only the naval headquarters on Liugongdao Island remains. Admiral Ito writes to his Chinese counterpart, Admiral Ding Ruchang, urging defection. I believe your wisest course is to come to Japan and wait there until the fortunes of your country are again in the ascent. Will you throw in your lot with a country that you see falling to ruin, or will you preserve what strength remains to you and form another plan hereafter? Vladimir Tregotedu. Ding remains silent but attempts to recapture one of the forts in early February, failing in the process. Soon after, Japanese torpedo boats strike, sinking the flagship Ding Yuan and another warship. Li then sends a grim telegram to Ding. No reinforcements are coming. The admiral arranges safe passage for his crew before taking his own life. The Japanese honor the agreement, with the Matsushima firing a ceremonial salute in his memory. Peace negotiations begin in April 1895 in Japan, but pause for a week when a Japanese civilian shoots Li in the face. Though wounded, Li survives, and on April 17th, both sides sign the Treaty of Shimonoseki. China acknowledges Korea's independence, agrees to pay Japan a large indemnity, opens key cities to Japanese trade, and grants Japan the same favored trade privileges as Western powers. China also cedes to Japan the Pescadores Islands, the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur, and the island of Formosa, modern-day Taiwan. However, the people of Formosa rise against Japanese rule in a 5-month insurgency. The First Sino-Japanese War costs around 20,000 Japanese, 30,000 Chinese, and between 30,000 and 50,000 Koreans their lives, leaving Korea devastated. The Hansong Sunbo newspaper mourns, "The innocent people who were killed are to be pitied as well as those who are yet alive." Jaeger 179. For China, the war exposes the collapse of its modernization drive and delivers a profound shock, even to Lee himself. "Affairs in my country have been so bound by tradition that I could not accomplish what I desired. Now, in the blink of an eye, 10 years have passed, and everything remains unchanged. I am ashamed of having great ambitions but lacking the power to achieve them." Jaeger 197. After centuries as East Asia's cultural and political heart, China has been crushed by a smaller power once within its own Confucian sphere, setting off internal unrest and inviting Western powers to demand new concessions. Japan's pride in its victory and its new great power status is short-lived. In May, Russia, France, and Germany launched the Triple Intervention, arguing that Japan's control of the Liaodong Peninsula threatens Korea, China, and Russia itself. Russian Minister Sergei Witta even warns of war. Japan's hostile actions on the continent were aimed mainly at Russia. "The planned occupation of southern Manchuria will endanger all of us and will likely lead to the total absorption of Korea by Japan. But if Japan cannot be convinced to give up Liaodong, Russia should begin hostilities against its fleet and bombard its ports." Jaeger 200-201. The Far East now becomes a central arena of global politics. Under pressure, Tokyo reluctantly returns the peninsula to China. Public outrage erupts across Japan, worsening when, in 1898, Russia coerces China into leasing the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur, alongside a railway concession in Manchuria. Japanese journalist Soho Tokutomi, once a liberal, now calls for vengeance. Japan will break the global monopoly of the Western race, destroy their privileges, and end the global domination of the whites. Mishra 165. Japan's ambitions in post-war Korea also face Russian resistance. Japanese agents assassinate Queen Min and restore the Taewongun, only for Russia to help King Kojong reclaim the throne in 1896. The growing rivalry between the Russian and Japanese empires will soon ignite once again, culminating in another war. The First Sino-Japanese War remains a lesser-known conflict, yet it laid the groundwork for the 20th century's great upheavals, including the Korean War. Despite its significance, it rarely appears in historical documentaries. At Real-Time History, we can explore such overlooked conflicts thanks to your support on Patreon. Monthly or annual contributions help us bring these complex stories to life. Visit patreon.com/realtimehistory to support our work. To learn more about the Russo-Japanese War just 10 years later, check out our documentary on our sister channel, The Great War. All sources for this video are listed in the description below. If you're watching on Patreon or Nebula, thank you. Your support makes this possible. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real-Time History, the only history channel that fights barbarians with barbarians.